Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Bordenaro. I'm the Executive Director of the Asset Leadership Network, and thank you for joining us for this spectacular launch to the ALN Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern program for 2023. We are very honored to have Peader Duffy, the Global ESG Practice Lead at Archer Integrated Risk Management and a key member of the ISO TC 309 governance standard. And there's some wonderful overlap that Jim Dieter has identified between ISO 55000 and the thinking that goes on behind TC 309. So before we get started with that, we have a new membership level, the ALN Platinum Organizational Member, and Onuma is the first of these Platinum Organizational members. And Onuma started off as an architecture firm that was way advanced in technology and was involved in the internet early on and evolved into building information models and the strategic thinking for large organizations to handle all their information, led him to asset management, and has got quite a storied tradition there. And as part of his Platinum Organizational membership, the company is going to be providing training for asset management. We'll get into that more later, but we're very honored to have Onuma as a Platinum Organizational member. And we're also very happy with our other organizational members, Jacobs, Definitive Logic, ABS Quality Evaluations, all provide excellent contributions to the ALN, as do our organizational members. And one of them, Smarter Companies, led by Mary Adams, is going to join us in overtime today, because I promise you today we'll go into overtime. And the rest of our organizational members. So Jim Dieter discovered a presentation by Peader Duffy, and so I'm going to let Jim Dieter take over here and talk about today's guest.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And welcome everybody with us today or viewing this at some time in the future. And it's great to welcome Peader here. Let me start by saying how I came across this. And I have to give credit to Tom Carpenter of Australia, who is on TC 251 and had been the delegate or the representative from TC 251 to the special ISO group looking into risk. And that has a story and a history all of itself, which I guess Peader knows something about. But Tom, at our TC 251 plenary meeting, mentioned Peader and this one graphic that we'll show at some point in the program here, that talks to value and includes the concept of risk. And I looked at it and I said, oh my God, this is it. This is the simple version of what we've been trying to express, and it really adds a lot of depth to it. So, and then I got to talk to Peader a couple times, and it's even better than that. So, well met, Peader. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, Jim. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
That's great. So tell people a little about yourself. Where are you, and a little bit about your background?
Sure. Centre of the known universe, which is Ireland. I'm in the south of Ireland, our second city in Cork. And this might give away my deep history, which is Irish military. I served in the military as a young officer, spent 15 years there. Knocked around the world quite a bit, risk, governance spaces. Spent about 3 years living and working in the States, New York. And about 18 months ago, did a deal with Archer, which is the world's largest governance risk compliance platform provider, about 800 customers, mostly Fortune 1000. And to bring my ESG team into Archer, set up that practice. And basically, our first kind of solution came out of the box around last June or thereabouts, this ESG being just the metrics to do with sustainability, long-term performance, and so forth. So that's my kind of pocketbook profile. I've heavily invested, obviously, in ISO, both in terms of the TC 262 risk management, where I'm the convener of the strategic advisory group there. And I'm one of the editors of the governance of organizations standard, the first ever global standard for governance of organizations. That's in TC 309.
Wow, that's a lot. And that's kind of the theme of a lot of what we've been talking about lately, but certainly about today is sort of the convergence of some of these topics, especially in that a lot of what we're talking about is targeting organizational leaders and policymakers. There's just incredible organizations and background and importance around asset lifecycle activities and asset management activities. But when we speak at those kind of conferences, there's always a frustration of trying to get to impact senior leadership. So that ESG conversation, the risk conversation, and the asset management conversation and asset leadership, as we would say, there's a lot of alignment about trying to impact senior leaders and how they manage organizations. So let's you come from this great risk background. Can you give us a couple minutes on maybe where the ISO effort on risk is, and any particular insight or thoughts you want to share on risk and how it might inform our asset management perspective?
Sure. I guess risk is facing, as a concept, as a series of industry practices, facing huge challenges today. Huge, like many other disciplines. So I came across a very interesting number about 3 years ago from one of the World Economic Forum reports that said that in the 21st century alone, we're going to experience, and we are experiencing, 20,000 years of technology advancement in this century alone, adjusted for the pace of change. Meaning, we all know how long it took for the television to take off as a product that's in everyone's home, to how long it took for mobile devices to take off, to everything else now. That coupled with a world which is clearly growing in uncertainty. We saw one single event, the spread of a virus, caused the world to come to a standstill. What these things tell us is that the traditional kind of doctrine in risk management was that you, in a rather linear fashion, identified a risk, then you set about assessing it, having put parameters around it, you monitor it, and you put treatments in place, and so forth. Well, what do you do if you can't identify the risks that are going to knock you over tomorrow morning? If you can't first identify them? And that is the case in most instances where there is a reducing number of risks in the so-called risk universe that can be mastered in any kind of demonstrably credible way. So it means that organizationally, organizations have to find a way of being pretty much indifferent to whatever happens, whatever's around the corner. And it means that at a board level, the board have to mandate. This is one of the particular things that we've written into one of the principles of governance of organizations in the risk governance principle. They have to mandate the requirement, however it's to be achieved, manifested, that organizations can sense and anticipate as an organization what's around the corner. Because at the moment, risk by and large is in the Department of No, the Risk and Compliance Department, the so-called second line of defense. Truthfully though, if you've got 100,000 folk or 1,000 folk in your organization, they're your risk managers. They're eyes and ears. How do you tap into that such that in a structured way, we get an organizational sense of what's around the corner? Organizations that can do that, that's a new competitive advantage, right? If you can do that ahead of your less adaptive competitors, then that's good for you. If you can't, you're probably dead, but just don't know it yet. That's the challenge in risk.
Yeah, with our conversations and some others that I've had in talking about leadership and and that chart of yours that we'll get to. It seems a leader could be seen to have two jobs. One is an organizational leader, and one is to use information and management techniques to systematize responses to situations. So anything you can figure out and understand, you program an answer and you decide ahead of time in the way you just said. But that leaves that the challenging portion is the unknown unknowns. And it seems like we place a lot of emphasis on managing information. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I would say what you can't you manage what you measure. But it doesn't mean that doesn't leave a lot of things that should be managed or could be managed, if they're identified, in the way you say. It also occurs to me that with the things you mentioned in climate change, et cetera, we could be in the century of risk and risk management. I think at least organizations I've worked for think of risk in an almost sort of complacent way. It's like, oh yeah, it's a thing we do risk management. But I mean, it's like risk management, how are we going to, as you said, how are we going to continue to exist is the risk.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, that I've, in the last revision to the global risk standard, ISO 31000, I led a team that did the design spec for that revision. The design spec was not accepted, it was thrown out by the traditionalists. Because I said, let's keep the word risk on the front cover, but not use it anywhere else at all. Why? Because risk simply is just an aid. It's a decision-making tool. And risk, in truth, if I'm sitting in New York, I'm going to drive down to DC, and I've got a mission-critical meeting. And I forget when I was living in New York, maybe I forget if I could do it in 4 or 5 or 6 hours. Let's say 6 hours comfortably, without running the risk of picking up any penalty points, right? My objective, while it's in New York, is to get to DC. That's my objective, get to DC in 6 hours. But let's say I got a mission critical meeting to get, okay? And I got to get there in 4, because if I get there on time, I'm going to sign the deal and make bunches of money. So I might decide I'm going to try and get there in 4 hours, and I'm going to pick up a bunch of penalty points along the way, because I'm prepared to accept the risks, because the real risk is not getting there on time. My objective is what it's all about. So anything that can stop me or slow me down on my journey to achieving an objective is a risk, right? Now, when it's explained like that, that's just organized common sense. And to the point about putting systems in place, the first principle in the governance of our organization, and we decided when we started doing this work that it had to be future-proofed. And we recognized in future-proofing this governance of our organization standard that the world is living in uncertainty, the pace of technology change, and all of that. And we said the first thing that people have to understand is how mission critical it is for organizations to understand their purpose, understand the why we are here, not what we do, but why we are here. And to articulate that in a handful of words, such that it doesn't just become a poster on the wall, but actually guides people in decision making. Because from a systems perspective, I worked a bunch of years ago with some really clever folk, and we tried to understand how we could automate strategic management, strategic risk thinking. We found we couldn't do it. And working on the principle of, let's say, banks today can set up a system whereby it can decide to give you a loan of €1,000, $1,000 in 5 minutes, once you meet certain minimum criteria. But that's a simple piece of business logic required there. At a strategic level in an organization, there's just too many variables. And you find that when you can identify the variables, but the length of time it takes to get the data in, right, to systems whereby the logic will work just won't apply. So truthfully, an organization has to really know why it's around, what its purpose is, a collective sense of what good or bad looks like in terms of decision making. And that's where corporate values also come in, such that your frontline decision maker can make a decision as quickly or better and faster than his competitor, which means he or she hasn't got time to run emails back and up and down the organization. So risk decision making is just part and parcel of every day. Any P&L owner is a risk manager. It's not the administrator back in the office. I might have gone off on a bit of a tangent there. Forgive me if I've done that. But I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of this kind of world we live in, where you can't see risk, you can't see assets, because most assets today are intangible, right? Which is a more recent phenomenon that maybe we talk about later as well.
Yeah, well, maybe it's time to look at that graphic. Does that sound like a good idea? Mike could
Sure.
bring it up.
So here we have an interesting slide from Bloomberg, sourced by ALN, and it shows the growth over recent decades in intangible assets over tangible assets, right? And I just I stole a kind of a title from a Bloomberg piece, S&P 500 assets we cannot see, okay? And this is one of those subliminal drivers to the explosion in ESG, because this particular phenomenon has been understood for some considerable time now by the big funds in particular. It's caused, for example, the International Federation of Accountants, IFAC, to put out some white papers recently on the notion that chief value officers are going through a rite of passage from being chief financial officers to chief value officers. Because if most of the assets that comprise the total value of the entity, the organization, are intangible, but chief CFOs typically can only count the tangibles, parameterize the tangibles, either they're out of a job or the organization's in trouble. So, and there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in the whole area of defining value accounting, because effectively these are organizations that now realize that they're sitting on this stack of capitals, most of which relate to human capital, societal capital, natural capital. There's the debate is yet to be concluded as to they define there's the debate as to whether there are 4 or 6 or 8 capitals and so forth. But the point is the value train has left the station, and the global leaders, the policymakers at the level of the institutes and the professional bodies are now beginning to grapple with this. And this is just another manifestation to that, the more recent number in terms which Mary provided last night. So it kind of tells the story as well. I mean, I was doing some work today. I was looking at I think it was a Fortune 50 or so sustainability report. And they were looking at the physical climate risks to their principal assets, their manufacturing production centers. The value they see in a piece of concrete, a campus, is not to do at all with the value of those physical assets. It's to do with what goes on within those buildings, right? What would happen if they weren't available? And there are a few things in terms of the business model and the operating model that are not touched and affected if the integrity of that asset base, just that one asset type classification of asset, if that at any point is undermined in terms of its integrity or so forth. So that's part of the complexity of leadership and decision making today. So I see Mike is prompting me again to this slide here, which is the value at risk slide. Just in a minute, on the top right hand kind of space of the continuum, we're talking here about the kind of decisions that are made at a board, at a strategic decision-making level, where decisions that are value-creating decisions are made and big bets are placed, big bets are placed with regards to views of the future. And people knowing that the decisions that they're making are laced with uncertainties, but they must make the decisions, because if they cannot grow, if they do not grow, then dividend income is not going to grow. If they say we're fine and dandy, we're good enough as it is, then they'll be outpaced, they'll be outstripped by their competitors, and their investors will leave them. Their employees will leave them because they won't see a future. So at the value creation level, risk decision making is really more of a thing of the gut, with very broad parameters in place. At the bottom left-hand area of the continuum, you have the value preservation space, where hopefully, having risked 100 million or whatever the number is, we get to a point where it goes from concept to project planning to execution to getting some mastery around the particular project that we have launched, and we're getting into an area of business as usual. Having made the value creation big risk decision at the top of the continuum, those same people in the board will say, we now have zero tolerance for risk with regards to any damage that would be done to our asset base, tangible and intangible, in the value preservation space. That's what this, at a very high level, value at risk continuum really is all about. It's about moving the discussion, not from risk, not from assets, but to the value that we are creating, the value that we are preserving, the value that we want to sustain over time. And what God helps, the value that we don't want to destroy, that we're not going to destroy. It requires a lot of joining up of dots, many of which are invisible to most people.
Yeah, so I think it's, it's really worth, and it's still, I'm still gaining awareness about all of this for sure. But, to me, that explanation really ties is where we can understand from an asset management perspective, where we spend a lot of time talking about value. And of course, we talk about risk as well. But a lot of time talking about value, but really that's what ESG is all about, is defining value and, what is value, and what organizations, what does success look like for organizations, and how should organizations be managed and judged? Do I have that right?
You do indeed, and in fact, the kind of term ESG is really just shorthand for sustainability. Okay, because ESG technically is really all of the E, S, and G topics. Really in aggregate, all ESG it comprises really most of the non-financial activities that take place in an organization to achieve a financial outcome, right? So it's a lot of stuff. And all of these E, S, and G topics, they all have different taxonomies, different units of measure, and different approaches. And the whole ESG debate that's going on at the moment, what's really happening is, apart from organizations, scrambling around trying to understand the stuff, gather these data, structure it, cleanse it such that it becomes decision useful. What's really happening is that in 5 years' time or so, certainly outside of the States, and I guess it's going to happen in the States as well, but you're going to be required to produce one report, which will be an integrated report with both the financial data and the non-financial data all in one place. And you're going to be required to aggregate all of these data along with the financial data. You've got to be able to relate financial performance with sustainability performance, where the metrics on the ESG side aren't kind of dollars in the bank, as it were, different units of measure and so forth. That's quite a challenge. At a design level, it's been worked out. And now The task forces are producing the guidances, and just now as well, you have the professionals beginning to train up their people, such that when it comes to in Europe in 2 years' time, in 2025, 12,000 companies, the biggest 12,000 companies in Europe, will have to produce sustainability reports. It's integrated report, they'll be producing those reports in 2025 on their 24 numbers, right? It's only going to be a limited assurance. That's the lower bar, but it's a beginning. But that is that's the real train that's left the station, because the capital markets, the pension funds, they want to know that the businesses they're investing in are going to be around in 20, 30 years' time, that they're going to be able to transition from the old world way of doing things, part of which is fossil fuels, to a green fuel economy, but also all the other things like AI and how do you attract and retain millennials? You know, it's a different challenge than attracting and training folk like you and I. We had different values back in the time that we were starting off.
Yeah, it's interesting to, equating, ESG in the way that you did. I'm thinking of people that equating it to sustainability. I'm sorry. We still have people here, and perhaps you do in Europe as well, that are against ESG reporting, which is like, seems hard to understand to me. But yeah, I guess too much. The thought is too much corporate oversight. But when you equate it with sustainability, which makes perfect sense, then how can you deny that that's an important investment criteria?
There's a point of view that maybe the term ESG should be retired in some structured way because it's just too confusing. It's kind of divisive as a term in the States, for example, and that it doesn't really, even to folk where even in parts of the world where it's not a divisive term. But the reality is that most people don't understand that ESG is about performance over the longer term, sustainable performance over the longer term. That's the game, because the world has become so uncertain. And if we think about it, the before COVID happened, the mother of all central banks, the Financial Stability Board, right? All the central banks was created in response to the global financial crisis, was asked by the G7 finance ministers, in response to the information they were getting, this metadata about uncertainty in the world, everything from anyone who reads the World Economic Forum reports, the risk reports, will see that at the level of finance ministers saying, oh, wow, things ain't as reliably, the world is becoming more uncertain. What are we going to do about it? Particularly in the context of climate, whatever about its origins, it's changing for sure. And they're saying, really, we want businesses to understand that most business models effectively are goosed. They're brown bread. They're finished. So how do we do that? And so it asked the FSB to do something about it. It created the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And it introduced a very, very simple framework, 4 pillars: governance, nothing new about that; strategy, nothing new about that; risk management, nothing new about that; metrics and targets. Now, that was new. Well, it wasn't so much new, but the particular metrics, right, about all this E stuff, the S stuff, and G stuff. And it was all about saving the economy, right? Saving the economy, getting the penny to drop. But all of that then was fast-tracked with COVID. And in truth, by the way, I would say to you that in terms of the kind of discussions I'm having with people and the information I have to hand, we should have been having these discussions 20 years ago. The chances are we haven't got a hope of achieving the climate reduction targets that the temperature reduction targets that we're hoping for. Not a hope.
Well, I knew this was not going to end at 30 minutes, but I do want to let people who need to move on go. But before anybody does go, and before we go into overtime, I want to thank Peader. This is just the start so everybody knows we're going to get Peter as involved as we possibly can. And one of the things you'll see at the end is another presentation. Thank you to our Platinum organizational member, to our patron members, to all of our organizational members. And then on Tuesday, I've got 14 January, that's wrong, it's 24th of January. Peter will be giving a full presentation on his, the slide that he showed one of. He's got about a 15-20 minute presentation that shows evolution of the data on those slides. And he'll be talking about that and further discussion about ESG and the whole CFO versus Chief Value Officer discussion. And to get the overtime started, I want to ask Jim, what got you so excited about the presentation that Peter gave?
Yeah, I still got more questions.
Okay.
No, well, we've been trying to find a simple way. I'm of the frame of mind that once you understand something, you can express it simply and generally. And we've been really, that slide is the story of the ALN. If the graph, the value of preservation is hugely important, and it's you could characterize that as asset lifecycle management. Is one view of that one, of that part of the slide, but that from the Asset Leadership Network perspective, we have focused on more of the value creation part, and what you can do with it. I always try to think of things, put things in simple terms. So for analogies, and I think of a car when I look at that graph, is why do you buy a car? Oh, I buy the car to make the car payments. Oh, I buy the car so I can put gas in it. Oh, I buy the car so I can maintain it. It's like, no, that's not why you buy a car. You buy a car so you can go places and do the things you want to do. And that's where the value creation part to me is thinking about how you're going to use that car in a way that provides value in that broad definition, way of a definition to you. It doesn't mean that maintaining it isn't critically important and fueling it isn't critically important, but it's it's that big picture. And that graphic just I'd be interested to see how long it takes people to kind of wrap their head around it, because it was really an aha moment for me pretty quickly when I looked at the categories. But then we think about it a lot. For others, I'd be interested to see how that resonates with others. But I think it will.
We have highlighted Peter's presentation, a video presentation, and have provided the link through the newsletter. Like I said, it's about 15-20 minute presentation. And we've been informing Peter about asset management and where we are at. And so I'm looking forward to his presentation on January 24th to see if he has any new information that he relates as he gives his presentation, because he starts off with that slide with a little bit of information and keeps adding information. So we're really honored to have that. So Jim, what were the other questions you had?
Well, actually 2 words. The first one is opportunity and how it relates to risk, because we had big discussions in 55,000 about that. And I was one of the ones that dug my heels in and said, every time we say risk, we needed to say opportunity as well. And what your thoughts on that are. My thoughts have gone back and forth. And the other one is time, and how, the time dimension of all this seems very important, but it's not something we often think about. We think about trying to understand the now, and the time dimension, how that plays into it. Have any less than hour-long thoughts on either of those?
So I guess if we go back to the origin, by the way, of that value at risk continuum. That was a contribution that I made on behalf of TC 309 to the discussion on within ISO, where a task force has been created to try and get to some sort of an alignment between some 400 definitions of risk within ISO. There is a definition that exists within ISO 31000, but it only works at the organizational strategy setting level. And it speaks to the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of an objective. And on that basis, risk is a neutral thing. It is neutral. So whereas if I'm in a health and safety kind of role within an organization, risk can only be a bad thing, right? But if you think about it in the context of, let's say the military, right? My background, at the level of a general, bringing a formation of 10,000 men, women across terrain, and he's got to liberate a town. His objective is liberate the town, free the civilians with minimum harm. And he sees that as an opportunity. Now, the poor guy in the trench that's got to get up and go over open ground, right, with his rifle butt to his shoulder, he doesn't see the opportunity. He sees death or injury, right? So you see these two people now in a continuum, right? Theoretically, the soldier is committed to the objective, but practically he's not. He's focused on staying alive because for him, risk is bad. He might lose his life. For the general, risk if he doesn't take it, the town is not going to be liberated. So at that strategic level, risk is neutral. And what I'm trying to achieve within the task force is that effectively an ontology might be created. And maybe that visualization of the continuum, maybe more of a yin yang, might work as opposed to that above and below us at the X line. Doesn't really work sometimes for some people. So I'm kind of a Socratic in my kind of approaches. I think, I like to think at least. So I'm saying, I don't care whether you like my ideas or not. I don't care whether you like the visualization or not. If through a series of conversations, we get to a realization, it's not what you said here, but with these additions or refinements, this is what good looks like. Then for everybody, the dial moves going forward, everybody benefits. So I'm not wedded to any of the ideas. What I'm wedded to is the idea that we can get to some sort of alignment and better understanding, because that integration of financial and non-financial information, we're now in the era of digital reporting, XBRL and all of that. We simply cannot, it just does not make sense from a data as an asset perspective to have all these different definitions and different units of measure. There's no alignment, no normalization. It's a mess. It's got to get sorted. And it will be sorted. It'll be slow. It will be sorted. I went on a bit too far, I know that. Sorry.
Oh, no, you just entrenched yourself in the list of potential ALN senior fellows. I'll bring it up at the next board meeting. No, your thinking is perfectly aligned with the ALN, and your words are a little bit ahead. So that's that's who we want to be talking with. And last year we met Mary Adams, and she joined through her company, Smarter Companies, and she's now with Insight 7, and she's big into ESG. And this is a little preview of what will be happening on January 24th, where you'll give a presentation and then Mary will join in a discussion. Mary, how are you doing?
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Jim and Peter.
You can turn your camera on if you want to, but you don't have to.
No, I can. It's not showing that I have that option.
Oh, I'm sorry. So while I'm adjusting here, what have you thought of the discussion?
Well, I love it. We all love going deeply on these topics. A couple thoughts I had. The one thing I point out that if we just look at financial and then ESG, when big thing that we're missing that's not in the financial calculations is the,
I promoted Mary to panelist and cut her off in doing so. Sorry for the interruption, Mary.
that's fine. No, but you know, the digital assets are very considerable, and they're not in the accounting model to a huge degree as well. So it's definitely something, you know, we want to think about. And I loved your statement about 100,000 people in a company all being risk managers. I think that that's really the fundamental challenge here, is that we tended to think so top down. And, you know, if you think about the tools that people have in a company to connect the dots, I mean, you got financial statements, the chart of accounts covers, you know, everything that you spend money on. You have the org chart that tells you who does what, but there's no value chart. There's no value map. And that's the really interesting thing to me is, you know, risk and value, as we've made clear here, go hand in hand, right? So value, destruction, preservation, and creation depend on those 100,000 people. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Well, look, Mary,
interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
I'm just going to say that, Mary, you know, you're an international expert and authority on integrated reporting, and you're intimately familiar with the integrated reporting model from the IIRC. And I really like that piece of imagery. It speaks of capitals on the left, business model in the center, activities running through the business model, and there's a change in output and outcomes. And I think that once people begin to think of a company as comprised of a stack of capitals, and once they begin to think in terms of what effect are the activities having on each of the capitals, they don't have to be having an effect on all the capitals at the same time. Sometimes you got to make a decision which will be to the detriment of one capital for the greater good of another capital, because the outcome you want to get is ultimately aligned with the objective, the purpose of the organization, and so forth. And it kind of sounds very technocratic the way I described it just now, but trust me, it's so simple. And you know, there are a lot of people, and Mary, you're the kind of person, and we've spoken about the ESG Exchange and so forth. But our challenge is, and our task is to make it easy, simple to apply for all of those 100,000 people. And sadly, you know, I would advocate, not sadly, but I would advocate quite happily, you need to get rid of some, retire some terms like risk. It's all about decision making. Once you know where you're going, when I was in the military about 1,000 years ago, we never used the risk word. And I was being trained as a young man to do stupid things, like put myself in harm's way. Why would you do that? Never use the risk word. We took precautions. Doing things safely was just comes out of our sinews, but being super clear about the objective and the mission statement, what we had to do to achieve that objective. And sometimes you might say, you know something, not today. But we never use the term risk or risk management. That's what I would advocate, getting to that state of understanding about the objective, how we get there safely with all our capitals intact to the extent possible. That's what I think it's about.
And I think that those people on the ground often know that a decision that's being made is going to destroy value in other capitals, but they don't have the tools or the information or the power to bring that into the decision. And I think that's all of our collective jobs, is to give people what they need to raise their hands and help make the right decisions.
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes you can't give everybody complete. Sorry, Jim, I could have crossed you earlier on. I'm going to stop now.
Oh, no, keep going.
Yeah, but
I was going to turn it a bit in the other direction. You know, thinking about ESG and the 6 capitals, I guess the 6 capitals or 4 in particular. And we've had discussions in the back that we have a sore point around the term human capital for, just a variety of historical reasons. I mean, I understand the concept. The analogy is if you own a sports team, you don't own Ronaldo. You own Ronaldo's services. He could quit tomorrow, and go do anything else he wants, maybe not play soccer. But the 6 capitals, really the use of the word capital is almost virtually analogous to asset. Yet, no. Okay, so that's a good. So I want to hear that answer. But then I can see assets throughout the 6 capitals, but it's really the word asset is really not in the forefront of that discussion. The
reason I shook my head, and that's probably not fair because I know the name of your organization is Asset Leadership Network, and I think you should think about all of the capitals. But the accountants talk about assets as something, and you're right, you don't own your human capital. And so I put in the chat, since I spoke with you last, because we had this conversation last year about human capital, we came up with a much better way of expressing it. And it's in that post that I just put. It's kind of a geeky post, but
we're geeks. Thank you.
So it's, if you think about ESG being another name for the triple bottom line, so people, profits, and planet, then you can say, well, really what we're talking about is relationship capital with our employees. And so that's how we've broken it down. And I don't think there's a magic number. I think, in fact, in our software, you can customize your capital structure. It's really, thinking about what are all the resources. And I know, Peter, I'd love to hear you talk about because you're part of the Capitals Coalition, right? What's going on there?
Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, there are protocols out in terms of natural capital, human and social capital, and so forth. But you used 2 words earlier on, resources and relationships. And I was listening today to a conversation between the chair and vice chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board, okay, ISB. And that now is a sibling of the International Accounting Standards Board. And between the two, IRC is co-owned and so forth, the integrated reporting model and so forth. But Sue Lloyd spoke about resources and relationships. And even though, ISB and IASB have to speak in primarily accounting terms, a lot of the language that ISB needs to use, there are no associated, they don't fit within accounting definitions. And so I guess that's why you shook your head, because you were right in that context. The accounting understanding of the word asset vis-a-vis the capitals as we understand them. So that's all been kind of reconciled. There's a massive re-education that's going on. And if you think about it, it took decades to get audit to the state now where we have it. We have to do now the same, the integration of financial and sustainability related non-financial information, get that to an audit ready state in a handful of years, not decades, because we don't have time. So the stresses and strains on people to learn, re-educate, reskill is going to be huge. And for that reason, we're going to have a lot of pushback as well, I suspect.
So I just put in the chat that the integrated reporting framework and the integrated thinking principles, which are those projects, the connective tissue that's being worked on. It's been worked on for 10 years, but it's been brought in as Peter mentioned to be that connective tissue between financial and sustainability.
And Jim,
Right.
what you're doing in the ALN, you know, you're bringing this whole kind of cohort of people and professionals. You're introducing them to where the world is going to be, right? It's inevitable. The value train has left the station, right? And what you're doing on the ALN is to become part of that journey, because if you don't, it'll overtake you. So I commend you for what you're doing in that context.
Yeah. Thanks. Mike, I didn't know that I have not been able to read the chat comments, but there's been lots of them. Is there anything in particular, you know, a question or a topic that you could highlight from that?
Well, we were actually hitting on all of them.
Ah,
It just naturally flowed. The way the audience is thinking is being addressed by the comments of our speakers. So I've copied them all, and I will share them so that it will inform our next event. And as a matter of fact, that will our newsletter will request people to have questions ready or submit questions for the presentation on the 24th, where we do a mashup presentation on asset management, governance, risk, ESG. And I think we should be addressing what we can do about it.
Yeah.
So
You know,
identifying the issues as we are is really important.
so and that's just the line of thinking that was just coming to me is to ask Mary and Peter, who is the target audience for your work? Who are you trying to impact?
100,000 people.
Well, you know, in the ESG Exchange, I'm a co-founder of it. It will begin to raise its head by the middle of this year. There's a physical event face-to-face taking place in London, Chatham House, with all the global standard setters, regulators, and the principal players. And the mandate of the ESG Exchange is to produce how to do ESG playbooks, right? But the exchange will not originate any content. All the good stuff's already been written and thought about. We're simply going to curate. And we need people with lots of scar tissue and huge experience, organizational experiential, like Mary, to work with the exchange. And we've got our ambition is to put 1 million people, managers from 10,000 multinational corporations through the sustainability reporting program.
That's a great
in the ESG Exchange. If you think about it, the trickle-down effect to supplier companies and partners would be huge. And we have a bigger number in relation to those in the SMEs, because the SME challenge, small and medium-sized enterprise challenge, is different to the multinational challenge. But there's a massive, whereas the exchange is not an educational body, effectively, we will have to just help people understand, to change their thinking. And we're using particular technologies, learning management systems, and so forth, not because we're educational, but because the functionality will allow us to help people better grasp what are sometimes kind of complex concepts and just bring them down into very basic. Do this, do this, do this. And eventually over time, if you keep on doing stuff, it'll become second nature, like learning to drive a car for the first time. So that's our ambition in the exchange.
That's the esgexchange.info.
Correct.
I've shared that. And if there's some way that the ALN can be supportive of that and get some of our UK or European people involved in that.
Absolutely.
Or maybe Mary can take a trip to London. Anyway, so there is a lot to do. And I shared with Peter and Mary and Jim earlier what Onuma Inc. is doing for the ALN, which is setting up demonstration workshop that helps us apply these principles. And when Mary and Peter see the approach and how it uses digital twins and representations of humans and things like that, there might be some way to assist what you're doing there also.
So I had a follow-up question to the targets and that's, what's the counterforce you're running into? What's the resistance? Is it just the usual resistance to change? Is there another line of thinking, or is it just helping people to see the next thing?
Yes.
I mean, I'm kind of, when I joined Archer 18 months ago and I brought the team with me, I kind of expected what I got, but what I find today is, because I'm kind of in a unique and very fortunate position, because it's around for the last 20 years and it's customer base. I'm talking to seriously senior people in very large organizations, and truthfully, it's not a case of resistance. It's a case of they being at their wits' end. They just don't know. You've got chief sustainability officers who might have been journalists 10 years ago, and a chief, a CSR, corporate sustainability reporting person 5 years ago, and now they're the CSO, and they've never had to think in terms of, I have to gather all these data, E, S, and G stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff in there. We have to identify where the stuff is, right? We have to cleanse it, we have to structure it, and we have to transform it so that it can all be then aggregated and made decision useful. That is for organizations that are large in nature. They depend hugely, even if they're private, they depend hugely on the debt markets. And investors today and lenders today now want deeper insight into what's going on in your organization, so they can make a better decision. Do I put money in or do I get out? So they're at their wits' end. The political debate is a different matter, but corporates are at their in my experience, at their wits' end, and a lot of them would wish it never happened, that it would all go away. But
well, I think that ties back to something that Jim said, which is to simply state something as an indication that you fully understand it. And what we're talking about, I think, is what the ALN is trying to do, which is rapid deployment of industry best practices. And what you're talking about is the leadership industry. And if we can assist in the rapid deployment of these concepts, so simply that people say, yeah, that's what I was going to do anyway, then we'll accelerate the need. And as long as you've identified the problem as reducing the time to acceptance of these concepts, I think that's something that we can address as a team, of co-conspirators who don't care about getting credit, just want to have the impact. That's one of the things that Jim taught me also.
Yeah.
So we've just got a couple minutes, obviously this can go on forever, and we knew it was going to be good. So we're going to continue this in just a couple weeks. But Mary, do you want to make a closing statement?
Yeah, I was just going to address Celia's last comment, because I think it speaks to, this transition we're making. And it's so easy to default to the financial side because that's what has governed, our thinking for so long. But the financial markets are changing. And the reason they're putting so much pressure on is that they've realized that, especially all the large portfolios, they've gotten bigger, the companies managing money, that there is no way that they can diversify away many of the risks that companies are facing today. And so if you can't buy one company and offset it with another, you have to drive system change. And that's what's so unprecedented right now, is that the financial markets are pushing for fundamental change in how you think. I mean, I never expected to see financial and sustainability standards move side by side so quickly, and yet they have. So that's for me a cause for hope. But it's a huge challenge.
Well,
So,
thank you, Mary, and thank
yeah.
you, Cecilia, for your comment. Peter?
Oh, I couldn't, Mary just nailed it there. She's absolutely right. It's all about the money. ESG is not about wokeism, it's about the money and sustainable performance over the longer term and keeping global economies running. Because if you don't have that, then the hungry man becomes an angry man. And that's not good.
Jim?
I love this conversation. Maybe my favorite so far of any we've had with the ALN, and that's saying something. But this conversation certainly needs to continue from an ALN perspective as we understand how all these pieces fit together. I think we continue to think we can make a difference, and as obviously both of you do. And we're looking for ways that we can help make a difference. That's what
Well,
live.
Oh, what were you saying, Jim?
That's what you live for.
Yes, so thank you all. This is very exciting. You've got our audience really fired up too. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. And we'll see everybody at Thursday at 3 next week.
Thank
That's
you
all.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Happy
Bye-bye.
2023, everyone.
Happy New Year.